September 16, 1992, London. A single trader sat in front of his screens with a plan so audacious, so mathematically perfect, that it would break one of the world's most powerful central banks. His name was George Soros, and he was about to make $1 billion in a single day, not through luck, but through pure conviction, and $10 billion in cold, calculated bets against the entire British government. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the Bank of England would surrender, the British pound would collapse, and Soros would become the man who crashed a currency. This is the story of Black Wednesday, the day one man proved that markets could overpower nations, the day that changed finance forever.
To understand how one man could break a nation, you first need to understand the man himself. George Soros wasn't born rich. He was born George Schwartz in Budapest, Hungary in 1930, just as the world was collapsing into economic chaos and fascism was rising. His Jewish family lived in constant danger. During World War II, his father paid a forger to give them false documents to survive the Holocaust. That experience, living on the edge, understanding how systems can fail catastrophically, seeing the fragility of institutions people trust, shaped everything about Soros. After the war, he escaped Hungary and arrived in London with almost nothing. He worked odd jobs, struggled, and eventually studied at the London School of Economics. But his real education came from the markets. He became obsessed with understanding how money moved, how systems worked, how the world's financial machinery actually functioned. In the 1960s, he started managing money. He was brilliant, obsessive, and most importantly, he thought differently. While other investors followed the crowd, Soros asked, what if everyone is wrong? He studied philosophy, psychology, and economics with equal intensity. He developed what he called reflexivity, the idea that markets aren't rational machines, but human systems driven by emotion, fear, and herd mentality. By the 1980s, Soros had become a legend. His quantum fund had generated returns that seemed almost impossible. He was wealthy beyond measure, but wealth wasn't his only motivation. Soros believed that understanding markets meant understanding power itself, and he was about to prove that an individual trader, armed with superior analysis and unlimited capital, could move mountains. He could challenge governments. He could make bets so large that they would force the entire world to acknowledge his vision of reality. This is the story of how one refugee who escaped the Holocaust became the man who would break the Bank of England, not through violence or politics, but through pure, cold mathematics and market mechanics.
By 1992, Europe was trying something ambitious and, as it turned out, dangerous. The European Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM, was an experiment. The idea was simple: lock the currencies of European nations together at fixed rates. No more wild fluctuations, no more chaos, just stability and order. It was supposed to be the foundation for a united Europe, but like many grand systems, it had a fatal flaw. The British pound was locked at an artificially high rate against the German Deutsche Mark. The math was wrong from the start. The pound was overvalued. It couldn't stay at that level forever. Everyone in the financial world knew it. The market knew it. The problem was the British government couldn't admit it.
Admitting it would mean humiliation. It would mean their economic policy had failed. It would mean they'd have to devalue the currency and face political disaster at home. So instead of letting the pound find its natural level, the Bank of England decided to defend it, no matter the cost, no matter what it would take. They announced they would buy pounds and sell Deutschemarks to keep the rate artificially high. It was a stand. It was a declaration of war against the market itself. And it was exactly what George Soros had been waiting for. He looked at this system, this fixed peg that couldn't hold, this government commitment to defend an indefensible position, and he saw a mathematical certainty. This wasn't gambling. This wasn't speculation. This was physics, a force meeting an immovable object. One of them had to break, and Soros knew which one it would be. The government had finite resources. The market had infinite liquidity. The government was defending a position with $40 billion in foreign exchange reserves. But the market could throw $100 billion at this problem, or $200 billion, or more. It was a battle of willpower and firepower, and the government would lose. Soros didn't see risk in this trade. He saw certainty, mathematical inevitability, and on September 15, 1992, he decided to bet everything on it.
George Soros didn't wake up on September 15th and decide to bet against the pound. This wasn't impulse. This was calculation. For months, he and his team had been analyzing the ERM system. They'd studied the numbers. They'd mapped the psychology. They'd understood the constraints. Soros knew something crucial that most traders didn't fully grasp. Governments are predictable. They follow rules. They have pride. They make decisions based on politics, not pure logic. The British government had made a political commitment to defend the pound. That commitment was absolute, which meant the Bank of England would fight until they literally ran out of ammunition. And Soros had calculated exactly how much ammunition they had. He knew their reserves. He knew their monthly deficit. He knew the math didn't work. So in the summer of 1992, Soros began building his position, quietly, methodically. He started buying Deutschmarks, billions of them. He was essentially betting that the pound would fall. But this wasn't a small speculation. This was a declaration of war. Soros had committed $10 billion to this trade. For context, that's an enormous amount of money, even by the standards of the largest hedge funds in the world. He wasn't alone in this bet. Other hedge fund managers like Julian Robertson and Paul Tudor Jones had seen the same weakness. They were making similar bets. But Soros was the largest, the most committed, the most willing to push it to the absolute limit. His team prepared meticulously. They modeled scenarios. They gamed out the government's responses. They prepared communications. They were ready for war. And then, on September 15, 1992, Soros gave the order. It was time. The Quantum Fund began to move massively. They started selling pounds in enormous quantities, billions upon billions of pounds hitting the market in waves. It was coordinated. It was relentless. It was designed to do one thing: break the government's will, force them to see that no matter how much they spent, no matter how hard they fought, they could not win. The market had spoken, and George Soros was the market's voice.
September 16, 1992. The markets opened in Asia first. The pound was already under pressure. Then Europe opened. The selling intensified. By the time London opened, it was clear this wasn't normal market movement. This was an assault. The Quantum Fund and its allies began to move in coordinated waves. Billions of pounds were being sold. Massive positions were being opened. The Bank of England, seeing the attack, decided to fight back. They announced they would defend the pound. They would raise interest rates. They would use their reserves to buy pounds and support the currency. The message was clear: we will not surrender. But the market didn't care about declarations. The market only cared about mathematics. And the mathematics said the pound had to fall. By mid-morning, the pressure was immense. The pound was sliding. The Bank of England was burning through reserves at an alarming rate. Soros watched the data coming in. His team was executing perfectly. The coordinated selling was working. The government was being forced to spend billions just to slow the decline. Every minute, the Bank of England's reserves were shrinking. $1 billion spent, then $2 billion, then $3 billion. The Bank of England raised interest rates again, from 10% to 12%, an emergency measure designed to make holding pounds more attractive, to slow the selling. It didn't work. By early afternoon, panic was spreading through the markets. Other traders, seeing what was happening, began to join the attack. They saw a government in retreat. They smelled blood. More selling, more pressure, more waves of pounds hitting the market. The pound was approaching the lower limit what the ERM allowed. If it breached that line, it would be over. The system would collapse. At 2:15 p.m., the Bank of England made a final announcement. Interest rates were being raised again to 15%. A desperate, all-in commitment. We will defend this currency at any cost. Soros looked at the data. He did the calculations. He saw what was coming. At 2:30 p.m., the Quantum Fund made its final, massive move. They began shorting the pound with even greater intensity. It was the knockout punch. The market knew, the government knew, everyone knew what was about to happen. At 3 p.m., after hours of futile defense, after spending billions of pounds of reserves, after raising interest rates to desperation levels, the Bank of England announced surrender. The pound was being withdrawn from the ERM. It would be allowed to float freely. In an instant, all of that defense, all of that spending, all of that commitment, it was gone, meaningless. The pound immediately fell 15% in value. Soros's bet had been perfect. The mathematics had been exact. And in a single day, George Soros made approximately $1 billion in profit. Not over a year, not over a month, in a single day. One man had broken the will of an entire nation's central bank. One trader had proven that markets could overpower governments. One calculation had changed the course of financial history. It was 4 p.m. Black Wednesday was over, and the world would never be quite the same.
The moment of surrender came at 3 p.m. London time. After hours of futile battle, after spending billions in reserves, after raising interest rates to desperation levels, the Bank of England officially announced the pound would be withdrawn from the exchange rate mechanism. It was over. The government had lost. And in that single moment, the entire financial world shifted. The pound immediately plummeted. Within minutes, it fell 15% in value. In the span of a few hours, a currency that the British government had sworn to defend at any cost had collapsed. The Bank of England's reserves had been depleted, their credibility had been shattered, and George Soros, he had won. Completely. Absolutely. The Quantum Fund's position was now worth $1 billion more than it had been that morning. $1 billion in a single day. The ripples spread instantly. Other traders who had ridden Soros's coattails on this trade suddenly found themselves massively profitable. The coordinated hedge funds had made extraordinary returns. But for everyone else, it was catastrophe.
British citizens who had been saving in pounds watched their savings lose value. Pensioners on fixed incomes saw their purchasing power evaporate. Export companies that had been counting on currency stability suddenly found the rules of the game had changed. The markets went into overdrive. Currency traders around the world began reassessing every assumption about European currency stability. If the British pound could fall, what about the Italian lira? What about the French franc? What about all the other currencies supposedly locked in place? Panic spread. Within days, other currencies came under attack. Other governments were forced to defend their pegs or abandon them. The entire system began to unravel. What had started as Soros's calculated bet against one currency had become a systemic crisis. The European financial system had been shaken to its core. But perhaps most importantly, something psychological had shifted. For decades, investors had assumed governments were ultimately in control, that central banks could defend whatever they wanted to defend, that institutions were ultimately more powerful than markets. Soros had just proved that wrong. He'd shown that if you had enough capital, if you understood the mathematics, if you were willing to push hard enough, you could break a government's will. You could force reality to conform to your analysis. You could move markets with such force that nations had to surrender. The political consequences were immediate. Norman Lamont, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, resigned. The government faced a crisis of confidence. The British public felt betrayed. Their government had spent billions defending the pound only to have it collapse anyway. Someone had made $1 billion from their pain. Someone had profited from their loss. The question everyone was asking, who was this man who had broken the Bank of England? Who was George Soros? The answer would soon reverberate around the world. He was the man who had proven markets were more powerful than governments. He was the man who had made $1 billion in a day. And he was only just beginning to make his mark on history.
The collapse of the pound didn't stay in Britain. It couldn't. The financial world is interconnected. What happens in London affects traders in New York, Singapore, Frankfurt, and everywhere else. Within hours, the shockwave spread globally. Other currencies that were supposedly locked in place suddenly came under intense pressure. The Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, the French franc, all of them were questioned. If the Bank of England couldn't defend the pound, who could defend these? Other governments scrambled to defend their currencies, spending billions in futile efforts to hold the line. Some succeeded temporarily. Others abandoned their pegs and let their currencies float, just as Britain had been forced to do. The European financial system, which had been built on the assumption of stability and fixed exchange rates, was suddenly revealed to be fragile. But the economic impact went far beyond currency trading. In Britain itself, the consequences were immediate and painful. Mortgage rates skyrocketed. Families who had taken out mortgages based on certain interest rate assumptions suddenly found their monthly payments were unaffordable. Homeowners defaulted. Foreclosures began. Entire towns that had depended on stability found themselves in crisis. Construction workers lost jobs. Retail sales collapsed as consumer confidence evaporated. Pensioners on fixed incomes lost purchasing power as the pound's value fell. The pain was real. It was immediate. It was widespread. Millions of British citizens suffered genuine economic hardship because of what happened on Black Wednesday, and they knew exactly who had caused it. George Soros became the villain in the British narrative. He was the foreign speculator who had profited from their pain. He was the man who had broken their country's currency for personal gain. There were calls for his arrest. There were death threats. His name became synonymous with financial predation. But in the global financial world, Soros had become a legend.
he had proved a fundamental truth: markets could overpower governments. If you had enough capital, enough analysis, and enough conviction, you could move the world. The lesson was learned by every trader, every hedge fund manager, every financial institution watching, and it would reshape how markets operated for decades to come. The consequences of Black Wednesday extended far beyond September 16, 1992. They echoed through the 1990s and beyond, influencing how governments thought about currency defense, how markets thought about government credibility, and how the entire financial system understood the balance of power between institutions and markets.
What was the legacy of Black Wednesday? What did it mean? On the surface, it was a simple story. A trader made $1 billion by betting against a currency. But the deeper significance was far more profound. George Soros had proved something that would reshape finance, economics, and the relationship between markets and governments forever. He proved that markets were more powerful than institutions. He proved that if you had enough capital, enough analysis, and enough conviction, you could overpower a central bank. You could force a government to surrender. You could move the world. This wasn't theoretical. This was proven fact. And every trader, every hedge fund manager, every financial institution watching understood the implication. The rules of the game had changed. In the years following Black Wednesday, the financial world transformed. Governments became more careful about making absolute commitments to defend currencies. Central banks became more aware of market power. The idea that institutions could simply impose their will on markets was shattered. But there was another lesson, perhaps more important. Complexity and interconnectedness create fragility. The system had seemed solid. It had seemed carefully designed. But it had one fatal flaw. It assumed governments were rational actors willing to accept losses to maintain credibility. Soros understood human psychology better than the system's designers. He understood that governments would defend a losing position because of pride and politics. He understood that this created an exploitable weakness, and he exploited it. The lesson for modern finance is crucial. When systems become too complex, when stakes become too high, when incentives become misaligned, fragility emerges. This lesson would repeat itself. In 1998, the Russian financial crisis would threaten to bring down hedge funds worldwide. In 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis would nearly destroy the entire global financial system. The pattern was the same: complexity, misaligned incentives, confidence that systems were safe, and then sudden, catastrophic failure. George Soros didn't just make $1 billion on Black Wednesday. He became a symbol of market power, a symbol of the limits of government control, a symbol of the dangers of false certainty. Some saw him as a brilliant analyst who understood reality better than institutions. Others saw him as a predator who profited from pain. The truth was more complex. He was both. He was a trader who understood mathematics better than most. He was also a man who profited from the suffering of millions. This is the uncomfortable reality of markets. They are amoral. They don't care about suffering. They only care about price discovery. And those who understand price discovery best can exploit it for enormous profit. The question Black Wednesday raises is not just about finance. It's about power, about who controls the world, about whether markets should overpower governments, about what responsibility the victors have toward the vanquished. These questions remain unanswered.
Black Wednesday taught us a fundamental truth about the modern world. Complexity creates fragility. When systems become too intricate, when incentives become misaligned, when institutions make absolute commitments they can't keep, collapse.
becomes inevitable. George Soros didn't create the weakness in the ERM system. He simply understood it better than anyone else. He saw what others missed, and he had the conviction to act on that insight. That's the real lesson. Not that one man can break a nation, but that in complex systems, understanding beats power, analysis beats assumptions, and those who see reality clearly will always triumph over those who cling to false certainties. This is still true today. Markets are more complex than ever. Interconnections are more dangerous than ever. And the question remains, who sees what's really happening? Who understands the fragility? Who will profit from the next inevitable collapse? The answer might be watching the markets right now. If you want to understand how money really works, how markets move, how crises happen, how individuals can reshape the world, subscribe to The Economic Story. We're exploring the hidden forces that move billions. New video every single day. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.